Our speaker is Michael Weiss, who, along with his co-author Hassan Hassan, has written what is, without a doubt, the definitive book on ISIS. As anyone will tell you, Michael is the go-to person for those seeking to understand the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Let's begin. In the introduction to your book, you write that this book is personal. So before we delve into questions about the origins of ISIS, would you tell us what you meant by that?
Sure. Well, for my co-author Hassan Hassan, he's a Syrian national and comes from a town called Abu Kamal in the eastern province of Deir Zor. This is a town that's now controlled by ISIS. He's lived in Abu Dhabi for a long time. He's now in London, but was watching in slow motion as his country was basically burnt to the ground and destroyed. For me, it's personal because I was working at a British think tank in 2011, and we were covering all the nations that were then undergoing the cataclysm or convulsion, I think rather wrongly described as the Arab Spring. And the Syria file literally just fell into my lap one day. I was told, here, this is the one we haven't done, you need to cover it. And truth be told, I didn't know much about Syria. I'm a journalist by training, so I started to investigate. I got to know some of the early activists and opposition figures on the ground. I don't think it's any secret, or I'm covering myself in any indignity to say that I befriended a lot of them. Because what I found was there was by and large a kind of cohesion to what they wanted. Economic reform, first to start. The Assad clan for 40 years has run mostly like a mafia, not all that dissimilar to the Putin system that is now backing it both diplomatically and militarily. And the original protest was not a revolution, was not a call for, we seek the toppling of the regime. It was a call for greater enfranchisement and liberalization. They wanted democracy. They wanted to have a pro-Western orientation. The countries they modeled themselves on, France, the United States, and then in the secondary or tertiary categories, other Middle Eastern nations such as Tunisia, Turkey. In every city in Syria, and we did a sample survey of the opposition from Damascus to Daraa to Hama to Homs, it was similar. And I found that rather remarkable. I went to Syria in 2012. This was during Ramadan, so summer of 2012, embedded with the Free Syrian Army, which had just then liberated not all of Aleppo city, but a quarter of Aleppo known as Bab al-Hadid. I spent about 36 hours in country. I stayed in a town known as Al-Bab, which is about an hour's drive north of Aleppo city, spent the night there, then drove into Aleppo and sort of surveyed what was then, the thing that struck me the most was the garbage had piled up so high. They were almost like barricades. Entire infrastructure just blasted out by aerial bombardment and artillery shelling. The people I stayed with in Al-Bab, the family, in fact, in whose home I was domiciled for 24 hours or so, were since driven out 7 months later by ISIS. So when I got there, they had just liberated Al-Bab from Assad. And what the regime would do was it would shell things like the hospital and any kind of local civil services such that people couldn't be treated for wounds. They couldn't receive food, oil supplies, fuel, petrol were running very, very low. What I was struck by was the indomitable optimism. A lot of the people there spoke English. They had had training as engineers or studied because they wanted to eventually come to the West. At night, even though there were still armed rebels, what was then the Free Syrian Army, at night, a lot of these guys put down their Kalashnikovs and did something remarkable, at least to my sort of untrained Western eyes. They donned white gloves, they picked up garbage bags and brooms and started to clean up all the rubble that was left by the regime bombardment. And I talked to people as young as 14 years old to well into their 30s. And remember, this protest movement, this rebellion was led by the young. The average age, I think, was probably in the early 20s to maybe mid-20s, the local coordination committees. And I said to them, what are you doing? You've become the Free Syrian street cleaners all of a sudden. And they said, well, that's right. That's because for 40 years, to do anything in this country, you had to ask permission, or you had to pay a bribe, or you were living under the yoke of this totalitarian state. And this is the first time that we felt like a free people. So for me, it's personal because as a journalist, I saw the degeneration and the decline of what had started as, I think, a very noble cause and now has become this awful calamity. It doesn't even do to describe it as a civil war any longer. There are so many sideshow conflicts. There are so many civil wars taking place.
I think many readers might be surprised to discover that you begin by talking about a militant Jordanian, Abu Musab al-Zakari, who fought in Afghanistan,
Right.
joined al-Qaeda there, and later moved into Iraq. Why did you begin with him?
Well, he's the founder of the feast. One of the reasons we wrote this book is I was doing a lot of media in June of 2014 when ISIS stormed into Mosul and sacked a provincial capital in Iraq. And the question it was always presented to me was, where did they come from? And I thought this was the most bizarre question I'd ever heard. It was like the Viet Cong, had taken over a third of Southeast Asia in 1985, and CNN and the Reagan administration were scratching their heads and saying, well, where did they come from? They just have a different name. This was al-Qaeda in Iraq. We have been at war with them for well over a decade. Zarqawi, as you mentioned, was a Jordanian jihadist of very humble origins. He was from a Palestinian refugee camp in Jordan, although he himself is not a Palestinian refugee. And was sort of, by an accident of history, ended up founding the most formidable terror group known to man, because everything about him was banal and anticlimactic. He was not a great thinker. He was not a great theoretician of jihad. He was kind of an idiot, semi-literate, even in Arabic. But through happenstance, he went over to Afghanistan twice. The first time, it was to join the Afghan-Soviet war on the side of the Mujahideen. The problem is he arrived too late, and the Soviets were already withdrawing. So he kind of bopped around Pakistan and Afghanistan with pretenses of being a journalist to try and chronicle the exploits of the great Afghan Arabs, or the Mujahideen. His mentor, a guy called al-Maqdisi, who was the great scholar and the great theoretician of jihad, sort of nurtured and cultivated him when they returned to Jordan together. They founded a small, rather uneventful, pathetic terror group which was completely infiltrated by the Jordanian intelligence services, and were thrown into prison together. Now in jail, Zarqawi actually came into his own. He was charismatic, and prisons in the Middle East, whether they're run by Arab dictatorships or indeed by the United States, are essentially academies for jihadism. What ends up happening is the natural leadership, the charismatic Hitler or Stalin types, rise to the top. They become wranglers of men. People flock to them. They look to them to break up disputes or to solve any kind of crises or conflicts. And it was here that Zarqawi began to hone some of his skills. He went back. He was let out of prison in 1999 as part of a general amnesty that coincided with the ascension of the current monarch of Jordan. Went back to Afghanistan, met Osama bin Laden. And the interesting thing about this meeting was very fateful. In 1999 in Kandahar, they didn't like each other at all. And the difference is, without getting too much into the arcana of jihad, by this point, bin Laden was what was known as a far enemy ideologue. He believed, he had migrated from the viewpoint of, let us overthrow the kleptocratic and defunct Arab dictatorships which do not embody the true Islam, and go after the really big fish, which is the United States, right? Zarqawi was still of the belief, he was of what they called the near enemy ideologue. He said, no, the problem starts at home. So because he was from Jordan, his beef was with the Hashemite monarchy. He wanted to overthrow the Jordanian government. The other problem with Zarqawi was he was a genocidal maniac who wanted to go after the Shia. Why did this upset bin Laden? Again, this is not to present Osama bin Laden as a moderate or a mensch of any kind, but there are these differences and they need to be understood. Bin Laden's mother was a Syrian Alawite. The Alawite clan, which is what the Assads belong to, is a schismatic sect of Shia Islam. So with Zarqawi declaring all-out war against the Shia, he was upsetting Osama, going after his mama, essentially. Nonetheless, they struck a pragmatic accord because he saw in Zarqawi, or rather his lieutenant saw in Zarqawi, potential. He gave Zarqawi a startup loan, about $200,000, to build a military training base in Afghanistan. And by all accounts, the base was actually very successful. He was grooming these militants. When the U.S. invaded Afghanistan after 9/11, and everybody fled, including Zarqawi, who migrated first into, it's a little bit unclear, we know he spent some time in Iran, he's probably spent time in Syria. Osama bin Laden did something very smart. He predicted that the United States was not going to stop in Afghanistan. You know, these guys pay very close attention to the policy discussions and Western media. He knew that a war was coming and it was going to happen in Iraq. So what he did was he issued an instruction that the socialist infidels, meaning the Saddam Hussein Ba'ath regime, should take up common cause with the Mujahideen, with the Islamic fundamentalist fighters, or vice versa. Zarqawi at this point was not really a paid-up member of al-Qaeda. Like I say, you know, he had run a training camp on Osama's dime, but these relationships were not so hierarchical. It was what I call Rolodex pragmatism. He knew the right guy, he got some money, but he had not declared bayat to bin Laden. He had not pledged allegiance to him yet. Nonetheless, Zarqawi made his way into Iraq. When we invaded, we did some very fateful and stupid things. You all remember de-Baathification, right? The first 3 tiers of the Ba'ath Party were completely, you were prohibited from public service. So these people were rendered unemployed with the stroke of a pen. The second big thing we did was we disbanded the Iraqi military. So this meant that even if you were a low-level private or corporal in Saddam's army, you were drawing a salary, and even if you had abandoned your tank or your armored personnel carrier and ran away in the face of 100,000 invading American soldiers, you were also rendered unemployed. Why did this matter? Iraq was, under Saddam, a minority rule state. You know, the Sunnis are the minority, the Shia are the majority. The Sunnis, as a result of decades of Ba'ath rule, lived very high on the hog. It was a patronage economy. The same system, by the way, in reverse, that Bashar al-Assad has put in place in Syria for 40 years, or his family has put in place for close to 40 years. So the Sunnis became immediately disenfranchised, and they felt like all of the privileges, and admittedly privileges of essentially an apartheid state, just went up in smoke with the advancing US columns. Zarqawi was very clever. He exploited this sociological crisis in Iraq. He started blowing things up. The 2 most spectacular attacks he launched with or debuted with was against the United Nations installation in Baghdad and also the Jordanian embassy, because he hadn't forgotten what his true fight was against, again, the Kingdom of Jordan. Well, he did so well that eventually bin Laden finally decided, you know what, you should link up with al-Qaeda. And Zarqawi said, great, because that'll mean an uninterrupted flow of finances coming from Waziristan, or wherever bin Laden had set up shop, Abbottabad, Pakistan, I guess. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, became the face of the anti-American and anti-Iraqi insurgency, even though the rank and file were, in the main, native Iraqis. Zarqawi, who was leading al-Qaeda in Iraq, was very Machiavellian and very clever. He knew that because he was running a minority franchise, the Sunnis could never take Baghdad by just sheer force of numbers by themselves as native Iraqis. The way to foment a real crisis was to go after the Shia. He hated the Shia, had a pathological bloodlust against them, but he thought if we go after the Shia radicals will further radicalize, the Shia will then attack Sunnis, and Sunnis will be driven into our fold. This is how we'll take over the country, because then Sunnis around the world will see this as a campaign not against the United States, but against Sunni Islam. And they will pour in from all corners of the globe, just as they did in Afghanistan, and that's how we will reclaim the throne, if you like. It's as much a project of Sunni restorationism as it is holy war. The US military finally figured out you can't defeat Sunni jihadism without Sunnis on side. That was the Anbar awakening, which started initially at the local level in 2005, 2006. The problem was, when we withdrew from Iraq in 2011, it wasn't just a military withdrawal, it was a political disengagement. All of the tribesmen that had partnered with us at great expense, a lot of them were killed, had bullseyes on their back and were now marked for retaliation by the Maliki government which ran the country. We backed Maliki in 2010, even though he didn't actually win the election and violated the Iraqi constitution, which we helped write in order to retain power. And this guy was seen by Sunnis as, Saddam as a Shia, essentially. He was doing pogroms. He was sending in, the Iraqi military, including his own loyalist militias, to suppress Sunni peaceful protest movements and revolts. This is all the mess that essentially created the sociological conditions under which ISIS was able to come back. So the top line here is the The Sunnis who turned against AQI then welcomed them back in because they no longer had that pragmatic relationship with the United States, and they said, hey, we'd rather work with you than partner with al-Maliki. The Syria crisis erupts in 2011. Throughout the entire history of the Iraq War, who was the guy financing or underwriting or patronizing jihadists flowing into Iraq more than anybody else in the Middle East? Bashar al-Assad. This guy was underwriting al-Qaeda in Iraq up until 2009. In fact, what would happen is if you were a jihadist in Tunisia, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, you would fly into Damascus International Airport. And there was actually a bus terminal that would ferry you into eastern Syria where you would be domiciled by an al-Qaeda in Iraq cleric who was working cheek by jowl with Assad's Mukhabarat or intelligence services, and then would send you across the border into Iraq to target the Americans or the Iraqis or whomever. Actually, the bus depot in Damascus was located, guess where? Right across the street from the U.S. Embassy. So this was happening all under the watch of the U.S. government. David Petraeus, Ryan Crocker, who was then U.S. ambassador to Iraq, were prevailing upon Assad, please shut your border, stop this relationship with jihadism. In 2009, according to a former Iraqi intelligence officer, one of the good guys, he had a guy in Zabadani, a town north of Damascus, wearing a wire, a spy. And the spy sat in on a meeting that consisted of al-Qaeda in Iraq, Saddam's Ba'ath Party agents, and the Syrian security services, planning terrorist attacks not even against the Americans, but against Iraqi state institutions. So again, the health ministry, the finance ministry, all of these weeks later were blown up in these spectacular attacks, vehicle-borne IEDs that left huge craters in the ground. So this is important to remember because the Syria revolution begins, or the protest movement begins in 2011. From day one, Assad's line is this: I am fighting not protesters or Democrats, I'm fighting al-Qaeda. And it's al-Qaeda sponsored by the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. Truly a coalition of the willing, if ever there were one, right? The problem was, how do you win the media narrative when you're shooting children? I mean, 12-year-old girls sniped through the eye by the security services. How do you win the media narrative when members of your own military, remember that the Syrian military, at the officer level, it's mostly Alawites because they benefited from this patronage system. They were promoted above the Sunnis. But the Sunni conscripts were the ones who were actually carrying the packs and the guns and going out and doing the fighting. They would be sent into territories and told, you're going to fight terrorists, except when they got there, they weren't terrorists. There were people marching in the streets with banners and saying, we want the downfall of the regime. So the military refused to open fire. The Mukhabarat came in and said, if you don't open fire on them, we're going to open fire on you. The first clashes and defections occurred actually in Idlib province in 2011 because the military refused to shoot peaceful, unarmed protesters. So Assad starts losing the war of ideas. So what does he do? 2011, he declares a general amnesty for what he pretends are political prisoners. In fact, a lot of the jihadis who he had once sent over into Iraq and then arrested when they came back to Syria were let out of prison. The three top Islamist brigades, or rebel units on the ground up until recently, the commanders of all three were former inmates of Sednaya prison in Damascus. They were let out in May of 2011 by Bashar al-Assad. Why did he do this? Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist or a Middle East expert to figure it out. He knew that as long as this campaign, this war of attrition was going on, actually a very brutal state suppression of a protest movement, people would radicalize. People would turn to the guys with the long black beards, promising them not even heaven on earth or virgins in the afterlife, but just saying to them, this guy came and he raped your daughter, or he threw your son into a prison and electrocuted his genitals. We're going to go blow him up. And the people would say, have at it. We think of ISIS as the most barbaric and brutal organization in the Middle East. Let me tell you, anything you've seen, anything you've read in newspapers about what they've done, Assad has done that and worse. Burning people alive, Assad's militias, Assad's Shabiha, these are mercenary gangs responsible for some of the worst massacres. They lock whole Sunni families in their homes and set the house on fire and let the families cook alive. You're just not seeing it on CNN.
Based on what you said, and I'm thinking something different from what I've thought till this moment. This is what I'm asking you. It is not, as I thought, religious fervor that's driving a lot of this. It is absolute greed, fanaticism, and other unimaginable forces of evil, as opposed to genuine religious fervor.
Well, no. I would say it's both. So my hypothesis is as follows. Are the guys in the military intelligence Shura councils, the guys behind Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, running the show, essentially, are they true blue fanatics who believe that the end of time is coming and will happen in a town called Dabak in the Aleppo suburbs? Are they doing all this? Are they all in to usher in the Armageddon? Or maybe because as of 2003, you know, they were smoking Cohiba cigars and drinking whiskey and, you know, keeping their wife and 7 mistresses and 25 children in clover. Maybe they're kind of pining for the good old days, and this is the best way to facilitate that. If they can take Damascus and Baghdad, or hell, not even Damascus, Aleppo and Baghdad, and tap into the reservoirs of ancient Islamic glory going back to the Abbasid Caliphate, why not? The rank and file who join ISIS, you know, if you turn on the US media and you see, oh, here's a 14-year-old boy from Tunisia, he can't tell you one hadith, you know, he hasn't read the Quran, much less memorized it. He's going off to do holy war. Why do you want to do holy war? To fight the infidels and the apostate. You know, look, these guys, when they come over, ISIS uses them as cannon fodder. Now the question is, and this is something Will McCants, who's written a very good book on the ISIS apocalypse, is, you know, does Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi really believe in the end of days? Based on what I know and people I've talked to, he absolutely does. But the interesting thing about him is he got into a university, Islamic University in Samarra, actually the Saddam Hussein Islamic University in Samarra, but that's my point. He got into it because his family had Ba'ath Party connections. So he too is a beneficiary, a profiteer of the Ain Sham regime. So again, you cannot take this in isolation. Anyone who tries to approach ISIS from a strictly counterterrorism point of view, frankly, I have no time for you. You're better off, frankly, if you really want to understand this group, read some of the anti-Stalinist literature of the 20th century. Why did intellectuals, why did people who knew nothing about Marxism-Leninism give themselves over to the Soviet Union? Because maybe they had lived through brutal war and occupation. They had been ruled by the Nazis beforehand. Or they didn't trust their own defunct and kleptocratic local government. So the Soviets came in and promised them bread and roses and, you know, made the trains run on time. And yeah, if you acted up, you got sent to the gulag. But so what? You know, don't discount the power of just stability, law and order, even if it's at the point of a gun, and it's sanguinary, and that's what ISIS is.
What are the U.S.'s vital interests in this region? What is a strategy for achieving them? And among, I would define as primary among the U.S.'s vital interests, is something about which we've heard nothing, which is the developing humanitarian crisis.
Let me take the last part first, as they used to say on Quiz Show. The humanitarian crisis, everyone's watching, you know, this exodus of refugees pouring into Europe and saying, oh, this is terrible, what can we do, what can we do? Well, they're fleeing, by and large, not from ISIS, but from Assad. This gets to the point of U.S. national interest. Does it matter to you that Hungary is tilting in a very dangerous direction with a Pujadist far-right leader who basically speaks of a holy war? You know, we don't want Muslims in our Christian nation, and we'll profit at the polls because of this. This is going to change European politics. If it changes European politics in the way I think, then you bet your butt the United States has a national interest in it, because it means the vitiation of NATO, it means the probable dismantlement of the European Union, and a host of other unforeseens or unknown unknowns. The question is, yeah, I agree. What is the strategic objective? What is it we're trying to achieve? Do we want to defeat or degrade and I don't know what the going euphemism is, ISIS? Fine. You have to start with first principles. How is ISIS able to hang on to so much territory? It's because you have a complete collapse of state institutions in Syria, and they're not doing the job that they claim they're doing, which is fighting the terrorists. They're fighting everybody but the terrorists, and they're fighting people who have actually fought the terrorists and beaten them before. So maybe it's worthwhile building up that constituency and helping them go after ISIS. Now, we have done this train and equip program, but I've done some deep reporting on this, and let me tell you, the problem wasn't in the implementation, it was in the conceptualization. Or as they say in computer programming, the bug is actually a feature. We were sending guys into Syria that we had trained up, but the commanders of their brigades had not been trained by the United States. I actually talked to CENTCOM. I said, you're sending guys in that you kind of sort of know as the commander of these units? They said, yeah. I said, and well, guess what happened? They took 20% of your weapons and they sold it to Al-Qaeda. What did you expect? These are not proxies or assets in any classical understanding of the term. So we're doing things half-assed. And let me be very frank with you, because as you can tell, I'm not looking for like the next job in the State Department or whatever. I just don't care. There is no U.S. policy for Syria. There is no U.S. policy to defeat ISIS. Why? Because Barack Obama is very tired. He doesn't care. He doesn't want this on his plate. He got his foreign policy legacy, the Iran deal, which he has described as his version of Obamacare in the international sphere. So this is from Barack to Hillary with love. Now it's on your doorstep. No, I'm serious. You think I'm being glib? And I talk to people in government all the time. And the focus is on, if I may say, meaningless bull. How can we counter the narrative on Twitter? What the hell do you mean counter the narrative on Twitter? These guys are chopping people's heads, burning them alive in cages, and you're talking about, hashtagging it. I mean, this is ridiculous. This is a big, big deal. This is not fun and games. This isn't about winning elections. And there are actual people's lives are at stake here. And I don't mean Americans. I mean Arabs. I mean Muslims who look at America now as at best incompetent, but at worst sinister. And in a way that I know you're going to say, well, they've always thought, no. Believe me, this is new. This is 2.0 anti-Americanism.
Michael, you have a captive audience. We adore you.
I go on for hours about this.
I know. It was terrific.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.